I'm one of those people that enjoy my exercise, but I don't like doing it socially. When I go jogging in a park that gets little to no activity from people, just because how wild it is. There are 3 different trails, and I try to run all of them without stopping for more than 30 seconds at a time. If I get too lazy, I penalize myself by doing them all over again. So, you get the idea that I'm out there by myself a lot. Well, I usually take it for granted that I'm the only one out there. One rainy day, I pushed myself to do some running, even though I didn't really feel like it. I tied my laces, did some burpees, and went for it, pushing myself extremely hard. I began to feel the runner's high when something I'll describe as unusual happened. I was pretty sure that I heard footsteps much heavier, mind you, coming directly behind me. But they were coinciding with my footsteps, and perfectly. I stopped. The sound of the other footsteps had stopped too. I looked around. There was no sign of anyone else on the trail with me. I felt chills well up, and a shiver shot down my spine. I shook them off and continued before my heartbeat had a chance to die down. As soon as I was back in pace, I heard the steps again, and they were once again timed perfectly to my own. I stopped. The steps stopped. Part of me wondering if it was the sound of my steps echoing and somehow being magnified by the woods. It was very strange and very eerie, and it's never happened to me when I was out there before. It wasn't an echo, because it happened at the same time that my feet hit the ground. I'd glanced around a second time. I never would have seen it had it been for what I can describe as glowing eyes. Everything else blended in with the dull earth tones of the forest, but the eyes gave me a reference point in which to discern everything else from. Once I saw the dim ember glow of the eyes, then I was able to make out the long ears that almost looked like horns, they were so sharp. Its scraggly fur was pulsating with each raspy breath, almost perfectly camouflaged in the backdrop of the forest. This, clearly, was a wolf that stood on 2 legs. It even had knees and legs like a human, bending forward instead of a dog that clearly was standing up, or trying to. It was poised to strike. I took a step backwards. It took a step forward in perfect time to my movements. I noped out of that forest so hard, running like a madman and feeling the hearing beast's pace mirroring my own. I made it out alive and unscathed. Only when my lungs were burning and I could not take another step did I look around and see if it was still following me. Either I lost it, or maybe it just lost interest in mimicking the pace and gait of a potential meal. I'm what they call an urban explorer. I break into abandoned buildings, take pictures, and film interesting things. And I post them online for people with the same fascination, and with all things abandoned, and rotting, and falling apart. You'd be amazed at the reach this sort of stuff has. Anyway, one time, I had broken into an abandoned mall in Miami. It appeared the perfect location, very remote. Once upon a day meant to draw in people that were on the highway. I found that lots of people had been there before me, so getting inside was pretty easy. It was a beautiful place for pictures. There was a lot of ceramic tile that was cracked, chipped, and missing. So it kind of had a Silent Hill 3 vibe. Look, Don't judge me. I don't get any creepy vibes until I try the Halloween store that dominated the rows of shops. I don't know which company used to run it, but it was by far the biggest shop in the whole place. The signs had all been taken down, but the decorations still remained. I guess they didn't have the time to move everything, or they didn't have the space to store it somewhere else. I found out real quick that the creepiest Halloween decorations are the ones that have been gathering in dust in a dark, condemned mall. Did I have a field day? There were real cobwebs on the fake cobwebs. I was looking at wrapping up and calling it quits when I heard a noise. Of course, you hear all kinds of things in abandoned buildings, mostly from the ceiling where all the birds are active. These noises I heard were coming on the ground level, right where I was. Nothing really spooks me. I've been doing this stuff for years, so I was very surprised to find the sound caused a serrated chill to drag itself up and down my spine. A very unusual experience. I reached for my flashlight, but fumbled it because of nerves, and it near died on impact to the floor. So, I took out my Zippo and clunked up a flame. After looking around, I saw that I was in a section of full-body costumes. You know, the stuff that would have cost a few $100. The masks for the suits were very, very well done, as in nerve-clawing terrifying. They all seemed to be looking at me, or looking at something only they could see in the glow of the flame. One suit stood out because of two things: how focused the eyes were, and they certainly seemed to be trained on me. Those same eyes were glowing with their own light. The suit was a towering wolf-like creature that had to be meant for two people to operate. There was no way one person was going to make this costume, or at least make it work believably. It was then the thing pulled back its lips in a snarl and showed its row of jagged teeth. And that's when I realized it was not a suit. It was very much the real thing. The awareness of it hit me like a towering ton of bricks falling. This was a real-life werewolf, hiding amongst the costumes in the abandoned store, and I didn't have anybody to tell about it. I was questioning if I was going to live long enough to tell anybody. So, I backed away slowly, keeping the lighter in front of me, gently waving it left and right. It was then focused on the flame, not I, so I tried to keep it that way. I don't know if I mesmerized it or what, but it didn't follow me more than 20 paces. I tried to leave in my panicked fashion so as to break it from its trance. So, yeah, I met a werewolf, and it let me go. And I know you're not going to believe me. I get it. It sounds like a cheesy ghost story, but I promise this is something that I've had to deal with. You're going to tell me that some of those old costumes took batteries, and sometimes that they last a very, very long time. Anyway, this is my story. You can take it or leave it. During one of my hikes, I heard out of a place the sound of a baby crying. At first, I thought it could have maybe been the cry of a coyote, but there was no mistaking it. There was a human child somewhere nearby, and it was making its presence known. Not wanting to be too conspicuous if things were really okay, I tried to circle the source of the sound instead of going straight for it. You can never be too sure. The sound was drawing me to a very thickly wooded area. I immediately thought that somebody was camping out, but I didn't see a fire or smoke, anything to suggest that there were adults nearby with a young child. My moral compass, however, wouldn't let me get far without making sure absolutely everything was okay or not. My anxiety retched when the baby's cry grew more urgent, the rhythm of its breaths faster, and its voice seeming to crack with effort. That's when I beelined it. I found myself diving into brush and thorns, stopping just short of a head that emerged from the top of some tall, thicker brush. It was the head of a weird-looking dog. I could see the neck that it was mounted on, and it seemed to be very thick, kind of like a bodybuilder, or maybe a big football player. Leaves and shrubbery concealed everything from the chest down. It was kind of like looking at the body of a gorilla, with hair as long and thick as, say, a bear. The crying seemed to be coming from the thing. I was both awestruck and puzzled. One, to see a giant humanoid wolf. Second, to think that it could be making the sound of a potentially crying infant. If I could believe what my eyes were seeing, perhaps its young were nearby, and they were making the sound. Whatever animal this was. It bared its teeth at me, and I took it for a sign of maternal protectiveness. Before I could get too far, it ducked its head, and I heard a rustling as the crying faded away in the distance. It later on hit the news that some campers at a park very close to where I had been hiking had woken up to find their infant daughter was missing. She had just disappeared the night before, and there's no way she could have toddled off all by herself. She was barely 3 months old. I wanted to be an informant so badly, but how do you tell anyone that their daughter was last spotted with a towering animal that walks on 2 legs? Sharing a story so far-fetched would basically be incriminating myself. I don't know. This happened a while ago, as of writing this, so I'm still debating if I could even take my story anywhere. I guess I practically am by sharing it with you. If I can stomach telling you, then I'll probably go ahead and tell the police what I saw and hope for the best. Wish me luck. I can't fathom telling a story about dogmen without telling a story about dogs. I had an aging male husky named Grimy. He had that heterochromia. You know, the 2 different colored eyes. He called the forest on my property in Vermont his own little doggy empire. News reached me that there had been a rash of wild coyotes that didn't have any qualms with picking on domestic dogs for food. So, I was afraid to let Grim wander too far. Against my basic principles as a dog owner, I chained him up so he couldn't wander off into the woods like he was used to. He didn't like that, none too much at all. One evening, I went out to check on old Grim, and I thought I could hear the wail of coyotes. Actually, that's exactly what I heard, and the sound was coming from where I had kept him chained up. I cursed myself for not thinking about this as a possible outcome, and so I rushed to my dog's rescue with a heavy shovel in my hand. I feared I was too late, and that would be the shovel I used to bury my dog instead of rescuing him. Sure enough, I came over to him just in time to see a bunch of the wild tramps run off when they saw me coming and making noise. I thought for sure that I'd see Grim crumpled up and torn open, but I didn't see him at all. The chain looked like it had been snapped, but that only could be possible if it were done with cutters. What thing on this earth could possibly snap an iron chain like that? I heard Grim whimpering. The sound interrupted my thoughts. I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from though, so I spun around to see my dog in the clutches of a creature I can only describe as a monster from the stinking pits of hell itself. It looked exactly like a man, crossbred with a mean dog. The head was ferociously wolvish. Everything else had a very brutish human aspect to it. The arms like tree trunks that held onto my dog very firmly. Grim looked at me. I couldn't read him. I was too worked up to tell how much terror he was seized by. He wasn't exactly relaxed, but he wasn't panicking either, and this threw me. He tried to wiggle free at the sight of me, and just like that, the monster let him go. It looked at me and bared its fangs, but other than that, I didn't do anything. And this thing then slowly walked backwards into the woods with its eyes slowly and heavily trained on me, as if making sure I wouldn't move a muscle. When it was clear that I wasn't going to chase it, it ran off. Before submitting this story, I did do a little bit of preliminary research, seeing what kind of experiences people have had with humanoid dogs. I'm guessing this would be under the Dogman category, correct? Assuming all these stories are true, it looks like it's not uncommon to have near misses with these creatures. But it looks like in this instance, the thing let me go, and my dog too. And it even seemed to perceive that my dog had a relationship with me. I have no idea what kind of instinct this understanding was working in. I guess I should consider myself lucky, and my dog even luckier. English is not my first language, so forgive me if I goof up and typing something wrong. One of the local gangs basically forced me into a secluded servitude. Namely, I had to pay a certain amount of money every single week if I wanted to live. They had me clearly outnumbered, so who was I to argue? For the record, this didn't happen in America. This was in a rural area in South America, long ago. Business was good for the most part, so I didn't have to worry about having their money. One day, I kind of did have to worry. They informed me they were raising my rent, and I told them they were ridiculous. They dragged me into an abandoned subway tunnel, or what I thought was a subway tunnel. I was locked up for 2 days in a closet, without food or water. I probably would have been in there much longer had it not been for the volunteer that decided to let me out. At first, I thought he was on drugs, because his eyes were open and his jaw was shivering. The man just could not speak. He told me in Spanish that he was sorry, and he begged me to ask God to forgive him, saying something about how he didn't want to end up like the others. Even though my family was heavily Catholic, I wasn't a religious man, but I humored him and told him that I would. He released my bonds, more or less, and dropped me onto the cold pavement. He ran away like he was being chased. It was very peculiar behavior, and I wondered what had gotten into him. As I was staggering out of these dugout tunnels, it occurred to me that he hadn't stuck around in order to escort me past his homeboys. Were the rest of them just as repentant as he was? Were they going to put me right back in the closet? The full import of what he said when he mentioned not ending up like the others didn't hit me until I saw the body of one of his friends lying in an expanding pool of blood. The further I went, the more bodies I saw. It occurred to me that my savior might have snapped and killed every one of his friends. But that was highly unlikely, especially when I saw the conditions some of these bodies were in. And mind you, these were heavily armed guards, automatic rifles, armor, you name it, essentially militant. And down here in South America, where many of them were cartel members, pretty much having access to anything they needed. Many looked like they had been attacked and killed to death by a wild animal. Just as I found some stairs leading out of the tunnels, I heard animalistic noises coming from behind me. I turned around and saw a hulking dog that it somehow developed the ability to walk on its hind legs, clutching a dead gang member in each paw. One of them seemed to still be alive and gibbering something in Spanish under his breath. I thought I was hallucinating everything, but everything else suggested that this was very real. I couldn't even think to hallucinate or be half delirious. These two men were then dragged away, barely alive and coated in blood. When I made it outside, I found a way to contact the police and told them about what happened. Although down here in South America, good luck. They had believed me that somebody else murdered all the cartel, but they had a hard time believing that it was some kind of jungle dog monster. The detectives that came out to look at the scene in person were a little less skeptical, but still skeptical nonetheless. Trust me, I wish that it had been just a hallucination. Since moving to America, I've since learned more of these creatures. I think they're called dogmen. But again, this happened many years ago, in northern South America, in a country where luckily the cartel hadn't quite become part of the government and police yet, although their militant force was very strong, hence part of the reason why I was told to pay rent to them in the first place. I'm just glad to be in a country that's free now, and long away from that. Oh, and I should make mention that this was when I was in my early 20s. I'm now in my early 40s. I'm an adult now, but the story that I'm about to tell you, although it happened when I was a kid, will never leave me. It is one of the most scariest encounters I have ever had, and for years, it's kept me awake at night. I was 10 at the time. My brothers were 6 and 13, and we, along with our parents, were off on a wonderful adventure. Well, that's how it felt to us. In reality, we were in a truck pulling a trailer in which we thought we were going to spend a few days driving around, finding fun stuff to do in the day, and cool places to park at night. It was on the way back from one of the fun places, a carnival where I'd finally gotten to experience some of the big kid rides, and on the lookout for some place to camp for the night when it happened. It was early evening, around 8:30 p.m., and since it was summertime, it was still pretty light outside. My little brother was fast asleep, having been worn out from all the fun, and I remember thinking I would likely also doze straight off as soon as my dad found somewhere to park. That was when there was a really, really loud bang, which came from the very rear of the trailer. I remember my dad stopping and cursing, and my mom simply insisting he get out and check, as possibly a deer had ran into the back. After all, she was a real sucker for any animal, stray or not. She didn't want to think that it might be lying out there hurt. So, my dad opened the door and told us all to stay in the truck whilst he took a look. We did, but of course we scooted around so we could see exactly what was happening. After a couple of minutes, he came back to the window to talk to Mom. I remember he looked kind of puzzled. There's a huge dent in the back of the trailer, but I don't see an animal anywhere. I can't think of a single animal that can make a dent like that and just walk away. Of course, we all wanted to go out and see that, since this was the 70s and far less traffic on the roads. This was also in the middle of nowhere. It was highly unlikely another vehicle would come steaming through. So we all went round back to the trailer, except my brother Jimmy, who was somehow managing to sleep through the entire show, and oohed and awed about the size of the dent. My dad may have used a few more expletives here, and what on earth could have caused it. That was when we heard a very, very low-pitched growl. Immediately, my mother told us to get back in the car and lock all the doors. She came back in too, whilst Dad stayed for just a moment. He wanted to know what the cause of the damage was from. Mom was yelling, "Jerry, get back in the car." But for some reason, my dad moved closer to the side of the road where the growling was coming from. We were all turned around in our seats to be able to see, and that was when we saw this thing. Emerging from the trees at the side of the road came a rather enormous-looking creature. It was taller and broader than my dad, and covered in this gross, thick, black hair. It stood up on two legs like a person, and had long, dangly arms. Then was the head. The head was huge. It looked way out of proportion with the body, even though that was massive too. Oh, and it was the head of a dog. That's right. This thing that came out of the trees growling at my dad made a huge dent in the back of the trailer, with no damage to itself, and was a virtual giant standing on two legs. Needless to say, we learned a few more new curse words as Dad yelled and ran back to the car. He slammed the door and put his foot down on the gas pedal. Bam! We were out of there. Dusty. I kept staring back at the side of the road. Seatbelts weren't really a thing back then. It just stood there watching until we rounded a nearby bend, and we couldn't see it anymore. We drove and drove that whole night, way further than the intended stop, but my dad wanted to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. I sure as hell don't know exactly what it was, or how something like that even existed in our world. But with God as my witness, I tell you to tell you, it was real, and I will never forget it. Most of the stories that I listen to or read about of people seeing unexplained stuff happen to them a long time ago, well, I don't doubt their credence. This particular story happened to me only a few weeks back. I'm not 100% sure exactly what I saw, because I enjoy reading about this stuff. My brain just went there rather fast than searching for a logical explanation. However, I'm pretty certain that I saw a dogman. I was driving back from work one evening, down a road that I use every single day. That's when I noticed a shape on the verge, not too far off in front of me. Whatever it was, it seemed kind of slumped over, and to be honest, my first thought was that it could be a bear. Although I've never seen a bear here ever, there are bears in my country, so it wasn't too much of a stretch, and this thing appeared to be pretty big, despite looking like it was crouched down. I wasn't exactly afraid, but definitely cautious, as you know. You don't want to make a bear cross, right? So, I moved the car over a little, as there wasn't any of cars about right then, and slowed down, as to not spook whatever it was. As I got closer, I could see that it was indeed crouching down. But it almost seemed to be kneeling, as if its arms were folded in front of it. I'm sure that sounds weird, but that's what it looked like. Almost like this thing was praying, or at least in some sort of stance that you might see in a church. I was definitely thinking that I was nigh on a certain bear, and that it couldn't do that when I got close enough to see exactly what this creature was in its weird position. And it was a creature, all right, but it wasn't a bear. It appeared to be a dog, a very huge dog. It must have been almost as big as me, and as I said, it was kneeling, so it wasn't even at its full height. I reckon if I had been standing, it would have been around 7 feet tall, if not more. The arms, as I have said, were placed upon its knees, and from my vantage point, I could see it has absolutely massive paws. Of course, the most important part was the head. Very similar to that of a German Shepherd, actually. And it seemed to be just staring. It didn't move. And for just a second, I truly wondered if it was just some brilliant, elaborate prank, although I couldn't think for the life of me why. But then, as I drove past it, staring at it, it indeed blinked. You can bet I put my foot down on the gas pedal and shot off like a bat out of hell. I did keep checking in my rearview mirror. The thing never moved. I for sure believe that it was indeed a dogman. I just have no idea why it was just sitting there in plain sight, as if it was waiting for something or someone. I've been back up and down that road several times since then, and I haven't seen any trace of it again. I'm currently a night security guard, and let me tell you, I have some pretty crazy sights that I've had over the years. If I believed in the supernatural, I'd be white from all the ghosts that I've witnessed. But you see, I don't believe. No matter how spooky something looks in the dark or on camera, come morning time, there usually is always a feasible explanation. But this one story I'm gonna share that doesn't involve spooks. This one, I ain't got no explanation for. It was around 2 a.m., and time for one of the many perimeter checks that I make during my shift. Some of the other guards just sit and watch the monitor, but despite doing this for a long time, I still think that I'd struggle to stay awake, just sitting there all night. So, I like to get outside no matter what the weather and stretch my legs and get some fresh air, all while making sure that everything is a-okay. There's nothing particularly valuable on site, but the reason they got us patrolling is because they keep some pretty nasty chemicals, and you don't want somebody breaking in and stealing them. That particular night, I can remember, was very cold, a real bitter wind, and even through my eyes were drooping enough to tell me that I needed to get up and out there and wake up. I was still wishing I could just be lazy for once and stay inside, as I was freezing outside. I was about halfway around when I heard a noise from just outside the fence. Now, it would take a real idiot to try and break through an electric fence, but we do get the odd animal disturbance when something comes nosing about. I could hear a sort of snuffling and panting, and was 99% sure that my visitor was not of the human variety. So, I flashed my torch around, not bothering to reach for my gun or the radio, as there's no point if it was just a curious raccoon or something. I couldn't see anything, but I could still hear the panting, and then a low growl sound. I still wasn't scared or even worried. Why would I be? I had a 10-foot tall electric fence covered in spikes and barbed wire fence in front of me. Even the angriest raccoon ever wasn't getting over that. Whatever it was doing out there, it seemed to be getting itself all rifled up. I could still hear this planty low growl noise, and now it seemed to be moving backwards and forwards the length of the side of the fence we were at, with some real speed building up. I caught just a glance of it with my flashlight, and for the first time, I remember feeling just a little bit of anxiety as I realized this wasn't no raccoon. It couldn't be, as it seemed way, way bigger. As I said, it was moving really fast, like sprinting up and down. But then it stopped and faced the fence, growling. I shone my light right onto it. Now, of course, I shone my torch at the level that I'd expected an animal would be, and all I could see was legs. Just 2 of them. As I slowly raised the flashlight up to my own eye level, I saw what was out there, It was a dog, because it had the head of a dog. Much kind of like a Doberman Pinscher, actually. It was curled up, and very sleek looking. But this dog was freaking huge, and stood up on two legs. Not like a wimpy old dog that stands up and begs. This was fully erect and upright, chest pumped out, huge glowing yellow eyes, its tongue nearly lolling out of its huge jaws. And then it ran, again, as quick as a flash. Now, as I said, I have seen plenty of ghosts and orbs and all that kind of crap, and they all have had a very reasonable explanation. But this, well, you tell me. Whenever I usually hear about any sort of creature sighting, it is almost always a one-off. It might be a stretch of road that person takes every day, but they never see this thing again. Or they go back in like an hour just to check, but there's no evidence that it was ever even there. I'm not saying that I don't believe these encounters are true, but wouldn't it seem even more believable if somebody saw one of these creatures pretty much every day? Well, welcome to my world. I live in cornfield country, and am a part in a huge working farm. I can oftentimes go for days without seeing another human, aside from family. But we never get lonely. There is another family that lives somewhere around here. We presume somewhat past the furthest cornfield, where the trees are. Only, they ain't the human kind of family. They're what I call dog people. Now, the stories that I've heard and encounters I have listened to all describe what people call a dogman. I don't know whether that is intentionally gender specific, or whether they just ain't getting too close to be able to tell if said creature is indeed a dog man or a lady. But unless they have some kind of way of reproducing, that is, unlike all other mammals, then I could presume they are indeed dog people. Because one day, the dog mama and papa brought along a young'un. Now, if you're thinking I just about sound crazy, I can't say I blame you, but it is the truth. Most days, for going on 3 years now, we see them, these dog people. They're about the size of us, maybe a bit shorter, bodies covered in hair, a dark sort of brown color. Again, a lot of people describe them as being all matted and dirty, but these look like they take care of themselves somewhat. They walk upright just like people, but you can tell they have hocks, because they're kind of bent at the knee joint, and they got very long arms. But instead of human hands, they don't quite have dog paws. They kind of resemble more like raccoon hands with sharp long claws. Of course, the thing that really makes these things stand out, if body hair ain't enough, are their heads. Big, overly sized dog heads, with very intelligent animal eyes. They got the small pointy ears on the top of their heads, long snouts, and big, big jaws. I'd be willing to bet any house how many sharp teeth they have, but they've never bared their teeth at us. We ain't ever given them a reason to. They kind of just cock their head to side sometimes, and listen. Obviously they don't talk back. I've heard them pant, whine, howl, but never growl at us. Now, it's not like I invite them into our home for dinner. I ain't out there making idle chit-chat with them neither, but most days they come with invisibility. Sometimes it is just to the perimeter of the field, so I can barely see them. Sometimes they come up much closer, stand there, appearing to listen in for something. They're usually always in a pair, but lately, there's only been one. When he appeared on his own, he never came too close, like he was being extra careful, just in case now he didn't have the safety in numbers. We wondered where his partner was, but just got on to living life. Then, one day, the other ones showed back up. Only this time there were 3 of them. Since then, sometimes just the one turns up often, if it is all 3. They don't tend to come quite so close now. Maybe just displaying that innate sense of protection. So there you go. I know this isn't the most exciting story about dogmen you'll ever hear. They have never tried to attack us, and have never acted to frighten us. Usually more just an attitude of, you stay on your side, and we stay on our side. Not that we are careless, of course. I ain't saying I'd let my grandkids run over and try to rub their tongues or nothing. But these creatures do exist. And now, I have seen with my own eyes that they are capable of procreation. I am sure that there's going to be more and more of them around, after seeing youngins. Before I forget to mention, beyond these large cornfields is miles and miles of thick forest that my family has owned for a very long time. I want to say it's probably 200 plus acres. I don't know the exact number, but I know it's less than 300 and more than 200. And that borders up against state game land. So, it's very possible they could be coming through there to here, for feeding or whatnot. I know there's also a very large population of deer that surround the very backside towards the edge of the cornfield, right where they go through. It makes sense if the corn brings the deer, and so the predators come after the deer. While I've never really gone exploring into the woods much, since I was never a hunter, more of a farmer, and a guy with a green thumb, I can't say that I've ever found anything out of place going on the back side of the property. Because our corn does draw in so much deer, it would make sense that these animals pay really no attention to us at all, and in fact, don't even show any hostility or aggression towards us. I believe that's for a reason. No, they don't want to be buddy-buddy, but what they do want is to be very close to their food supply. My older cousin has served time, and not only in the military, but also specific branches of government that deal with things hidden to the public eye. He has gone on several diving missions with other very experienced divers, experiencing strange creatures, and nearly dying, but that's for another story that I'll have to tell you later. He has had other run-ins with things that are not supposed to exist, and it's even had a couple Bigfoot counters here and there. But today, I'm going to be telling you about how he had encountered a dogman nest, or so he tells me, when he had gotten hired by a secret security firm to survey an area of land due to an unforeseen threat, is what they called it. My cousin had been hired several times by multiple companies as a quote-unquote cleanup person. He's kind of a jack of all trades and has had his hands in quite a few endeavors, including being sent out to kill several mountain lions and packs of coyotes, some that were endangering nearby communities' farms and livestock, but then again, that's not the point of why I'm writing to you. My cousin, see, he refuses to tell me the exact location, but says it's somewhere between Ohio and Kentucky, and that he was in the thick of the wilderness surveying this specific area. My cousin wasn't the type of person to ask questions. Usually, he was just given an assignment and an order, and that was it. He was only given a few basic supplies with his most prized tool on a journey, a machete. He made it to a certain point where he told me that he was able to tell, just by the look of the wilderness alone, that man had never stepped in this area before, and that he was the first human to be in those woods. The further he got in, the thicker the brush got, and the harder it became for him to get in. He told me even the atmosphere around him had started to change in a negative way. When asking him what he meant by that exactly, he could only explain that it got harder to breathe, and he could feel the presence of something else, meaning he was not alone. After continuing on further and further, getting closer to the coordinates he was given, he stumbled upon what looked like a large den, half shallow cavern and half built out of dirt. He said it was just kind of there, and the opening was enormous. Around 8 to 9 feet high, and about 5 feet in width, and was large enough that he could just basically walk in. He said you could just smell death emanating from every corner of this small cave. Being outside the entrance, you could even smell it more. Even though every fiber in his being was screaming to not go in, he said he felt like there was just this mysterious force pulling him in and drawing him in as if he had no control over his own body. Taking his flashlight on and out and gripping his machete, he made his way about 20 feet when the cavern inside opened up to a much larger area. He said if he had to guess, it was probably about 30 feet high, and a room that's roughly 50 yards across from where he was standing to the back wall. He said the smell of rotting animal and wet dog was so bad that he could hardly breathe, and couldn't be in there long. After quickly shining his light around, there were so many bones, he said. He saw so many skulls and bone piles. Animals, of course. He had no doubt in his mind that this was indeed the den of some large predator, probably a wolf or a pack of wolves. He said he was the only one in there for a handful of seconds because, besides the smell, he had this horrible feeling like he just shouldn't be in there and that he should leave now. Quickly exiting the cave, he made his way another 10 or so miles to the designated coordinates he was given, but said he was followed the rest of the way there. He said he could feel the presence of something quickly growing around him. It felt malicious. It became apparent more and more that he needed to get out of there, and quickly, and reach his coordinates. He explained to me that whatever it was following him, was tracking him like prey, but wasn't coming in close enough to reveal itself. He thought that to be odd, considering whatever it was clearly possessed enough strength and stamina to pounce on him and take him down. He believes that whatever it was also lived in the den that he had discovered, and that there were multiple of whatever this was following him wherever he was going. This went on until he reached his coordinated points where a helicopter had come to pick him up after using a special signalized device. Upon being picked up, and as he was going up in the air, he said he looked down and could see these tall, what he would describe as werewolf-looking beings standing and some were crouching just beyond the woodline, invisible if you were on foot, but totally exposed once you were in the air. Because of how spread apart the trees were in this clearing, since it was obviously big enough for a helicopter to land, he was able to see these beings very clearly. Said there was probably about 7 or 8 of them, and that they were pitch black, and instead on 2 legs, and resembled that of what you would see off of a Hollywood horror movie. Frightened, he did keep it to himself, but he told me that this wasn't his first rodeo, since he has had other strange encounters with weird beings like Bigfoot and other stuff. I'll be sure to send you that story about his diving experience and encountering something unknown. I need to start with telling you that I am a no bullshit kind of person. I don't like to lie or make stuff up, and because of my job, I have to be as honest and credible as possible and maintain somewhat of my integrity. I knew that if I told anybody besides you, and maybe a few other people who are open to this, I would probably be mocked and called crazy, so I figured I would give it a shot by telling you this. You can tell me what you think. You seem to know a lot about it, so maybe you can give me some pointers. I truck for a living, and a couple of months back, I hit and killed an animal that I couldn't identify. I did not stick around long enough to truly get a great look at it because I got the feeling that there were potentially more around the area, and that I may have pissed them off by killing one of their kind. I want to say I was somewhere between Illinois and Iowa, and I could tell you it was a long stretch of road, flatlands, and I was the only truck on the road at the time. It was early in the morning, and it was pitch black outside. I'm driving, and all of a sudden, this large black dog steps out on the road and looks right in my direction. When I say steps out, he steps out onto the road as close to where I was that I did not even have time to stop the truck at all, and all I could do was honk the horn. He was standing on two legs. It was too late for that though, and I ended up colliding with whatever this two-legged humanoid dog thing was. I heard the thud and had to pull over immediately to see what happened. So I pull over to the side of the road where there is barely any room to begin with and put my hazards on and grab my trusty flashlight. I run back there, and lying there on the road is this ugly looking thing. I'll tell you when I ain't ever seen anything that looks like this. This animal was ugly. It reminded me of a dog but looked so human-like it was startling. It wasn't too big. I would say maybe 5 feet high if I had to guess when I saw it. My initial reaction was that it was a child or a teenager in a costume, but that just wasn't the case. This thing was maimed up pretty well for my truck, so I did what most people would do and kicked it off the side of the road, not thinking too much of it. When I say this thing was ugly, I really mean that. When it died, part of its lower jaw was broken open, exposing all of its sharp, rigid teeth. I remember I gasped at how many teeth that it had, and it was like I was looking into the mouth of a shark, minus the serrated edges on the teeth. It had a shorter snout, but piercing, dull, now lifeless eyes. I sat there and crouched over it, shining my light and scanning over its body to see really what it was and to if I could properly identify what it was I had killed. But I could not. Maybe it was a mutated coyote, or possibly a wolf, but all of its sizes and dimensions were just wrong. Then again, it was maimed pretty good from the truck, and that it was a big, bloody mess. I would say the head was the most intact, and was really the only thing I had to go by trying to figure out what kind of animal this really was. When you and I had spoken about this previously on the phone, you had mentioned to me that it sounded like a dogman to you, or a juvenile dogman at that. See, I know virtually nothing about cryptids, or cryptozoology, or creatures that aren't supposed to exist, I should call them, but I can tell you I've never seen an animal that looked this way. The best way I can relay the feeling to you and your viewers, since I'm sure you will be reading this to them, is that it's kind of like seeing a dead lion for the first time if you've only ever seen house cats. You would be confused, amazed, and terrified at the sight of this massive dead animal, but you could tell by somewhat similar relation in size and shape that it was related to a familiar animal that you kind of knew. I think in the moment I probably chalked it up to just a mutated coyote or something, even though it walked out onto the road on two legs. I don't know. I think I was overcome by so much shock about what happened, I didn't really spend too much time with critical thinking. Tried not to get my boot covered in blood, and there really wasn't a good way to push it off the road, so I kinda just left it there. I know, I'm an asshole for that, but what am I supposed to do? I got back in my truck and left, and that's pretty much the end of that. To recap, I would say that when it stepped out onto the road, it seemed startled that my truck was there, and possibly did not know I was on the road so close when he had stepped out, like it was an accident. I maybe got a second to look at it before it looked right over at me, and then BAM! My truck hit this thing, collided, and I assume killed it on impact would be my best guess. A few years ago, in the fall, I had one of those dogman sons of bitches steal a buck from right outside the back of my truck. Long story short, because I'm not going to feed you a 7-page encounter story, so I'll keep it really brief. Long story short, I got me a 4-pointer, tagged it, and stuck him in the back of my truck. This was a good-sized buck too, and I was going to bring it to my friend who's a taxidermist because I wanted to keep the hide intact. But I guess that son of a bitch made sure that wasn't going to happen. I'm about 50 feet away from my truck, dealing with my tarps and getting them ready to cover my kill, as I hear my truck sitting down and what sounds like a boulder being thrown onto it, and I turn around and this dog-looking person, a dogman, reaches down from jumping up in the truck, grabs onto the buck with one hand, pulls it up and throws it over its shoulder in one fluid motion, all while turning and jumping into the trees with my kill. I can hardly believe what I just saw, so much so that my mouth was practically on the ground in sheer disbelief. This thing has never looked over at me, and it just grabbed its prize, or, well, my prize that it stole, and bolted into the woods. Of course, I screamed and hollered, but by the time I went to go get my gun out of the cab of my truck, it was long gone. This thing was fast, and I wasn't even afraid of the sheer size and speed of this thing, just pissed the fact that it took all my effort away. A month ago, I went over with my friends to some state game land area that's near their house to walk around in because, well, we were bored and we're in quarantine, and there's not much else to do. We just wanted to explore miles upon miles of dense, dark woods. I'm 18, and I thought it would be a fairly good idea if I brought weapons with me, and any sort of supplies in case anything happened, because we were just wanting to explore, and also wanting to do it at night where everything is in the blackness. I would like to think of us as a group of avid explorers. I, personally, love the thrill of being in danger sometimes and wanted to make sure we were taken care of in case we ran into a cougar or some sort of predator. We got out there pretty far, and we were doing just fine with flashlights and the equipment that we had. We wanted to keep a lookout and make sure that we wouldn't run into any nocturnal animals like skunks or anything like that. The woods that we were traversing through were dense and covered with foliage and short-cut trees, but we were determined to get as much out of the night as we could. And the further we went into the wilderness without anything happening, the braver we became and the hungrier we got for a thrill. At one point or another, we came to a dead deer, a buck at that was partially eaten. It looked fresh too, and we were amazed at the size of this buck and how it was torn open. We got creeped out because that meant there was either a cougar around or a bunch of coyotes, both being something we weren't really wanting to deal with. As we were checking out this carcass with our flashlights and looking at it a little more, we hear a crunching of leaves behind us, and we all shone our lights. The first thing we saw is huge white teeth glistening in the light, and a gaping snout full of dripping saliva. That's when we quickly noticed the glowing amber eyes shortly above it, and that these teeth belonged to whatever it is we were looking at. We were looking at a real-life werewolf in front of us, and we didn't stick around to see what was going to happen. I think we all booked it out of there so fast we probably made a dust storm. We booked it so fast and never looked back to see if this thing was following us, but I don't think it ever did. We got back to our cars and floored it out of there so fast. I used to think that monsters didn't exist, but I feel like that night I was proven wrong. I don't know what the hell is out there that looks exactly like a werewolf, but whatever it was we ran into, I'm sorry this encounter is so brief, but there's not a whole lot to it other than what we saw and that we booked it. I can't give you more specific, exact details because it was just so quick, but I can tell you confidently that all four of us saw exactly the same thing, and we collectively speculate that whatever we saw was in the process of possibly eating this dead buck, or was coming upon the corpse to eat since it was still fresh. I believe it growled at us because it thought we were coming to take its food, or even posed a threat, and we weren't about that life, so we ditched. I was driving home late one night when I saw what looked to be like a large dog or canid-like humanoid thing run across the road in front of me and jumped off the guardrail. The first thing I noticed was a large shape that was standing upright and running on two legs in front of my vehicle, just outside the limits of my headlights. It's been cleared, the road, in only a matter of seconds and leapt off into the night. It was dark and I couldn't make out a fur color, but it looked to be a smoky charcoal color gray, if I could put my best guess in. The first thing I noticed was it to have pointed ears in the snout, which is what ultimately gave it away as canid. The disturbing part was that it was running on two legs, and just like a dog would, bound off the side of the road, off the guardrail, like it would if it was on four legs. I know there is such a thing as wild dogs and all that, but something in my gut just tells me this wasn't a wild dog. It also looked nothing like a wolf or what a wild dog would look like, and it was much larger. Plus, the fact that I don't think any breed of dog can walk steadily on two legs for really any amount of distance, at least not comfortably, without shaking. It freaked me right the hell out, and I kept driving, keeping to my own business, hoping it wasn't planning on coming after me. Never ever ever saw it again after that. So, I've been listening to scary stories and cryptid encounters for years now, and my family has never really believed me, because I myself am a big believer in them, even though I've never had any personal accounts, thank you God. But just recently, my good mate's brother told me about that he ran into one of these dog werewolf things, whatever the hell they are, when he went hunting back in the fall. He told me that he must have got to this buck first before this dogman did, because, coincidentally, he thinks both him and the same creature were hunting the same buck. He claimed that it was pissed off and showed itself after he killed it, and even tried to go as far as attack him with the intent to kill. He let it take his kill and said he didn't want any part to play in fending that creature off. When I picked his brain about it for proof that he wasn't lying, he got really emotional and started freaking out, and his whole tone of voice changed. There's just a certain genuine and sincerity in somebody's tone when they're recalling a past traumatic experience that you can tell they're not lying. When he described it, he said it was hairy and had a longer snout, and it resembled the werewolves from the Underworld movies, is what he told me. Then he says it couldn't have been that though, because he knows that werewolves are fictional creatures and don't exist in the real world. So, what is it that he ran into? I think he ended his speculation with it with some sort of mutated or damaged or deranged wolf, or possibly mange, or even a hybrid. He doesn't know. Okay, I know you know a lot about dogmen, so I'm writing to you, asking for some help, and maybe even your viewers can help me. I have a barn, probably about a quarter-mile away from my house, and for whatever reason, stray cats love my land, and it never fails. Every spring, there always seems to be a new litter of kittens and cats that show up, so I always make it a thing to go out to the old barn and lay out some food and old blankets so they can make themselves a comfy home. I use some of the leftover straw and hay to kind of make it their own. Well, one night it was particularly windy and raining really hard, so I worried about them and wanted to make sure those little guys had plenty of food for the night, since it had been a few days since I checked up on them, and I didn't want them to go hungry or cold. I grabbed my flashlight and I walked out there, and as I get close to the barn, I'm hearing the cat start to go crazy, and I'm thinking to myself, what on earth? As I reach close to the barn, the door of it flings open, and this short, stubby little dogman, no more than 4.5 feet tall, runs out and stares at me right in the face like a deer caught in the headlights kind of look. I noticed immediately the dead cat in its mouth and 2 more in its hands. It just stares at me for a quick second, not moving a muscle, as if frozen, like caught up doing something that it shouldn't. While holding on to all 3 dead cats, it flies down onto all 4s and sprints off into the darkness far beyond the barn. Without even hesitating, I run into the barn to make sure the cats are okay, and there are a few missing, which wasn't too abnormal. They come and go at night and day, but in all, there is around 8 or so, and I was only seeing about 4 during this time. Usually, this time of night is when they all congregate in the barn and sleep, so I don't know if they're from the same litter or what, but either way, their numbers continue to shrink after that. The lowest the number got was probably 1 or 2 cats that I ever kept seeing, and the other ones kind of just disappeared after that. But like I said, there was always at least 1 or 2 cats around no matter what. I don't know for sure if that dogman saw that it was a free meal and broke in or what. I want to hunt that thing down, but if it's a young one, That means there's probably a mom and a dad somewhere close by, and I really don't want to feel parental wrath because I obliterated their child with a 12 gauge for going after my cats. Anyway, I want to mention to you that I've had a few other encounters with dogmen, which is why I know about them, and for whatever reason, there's this connection between me and them now, to where I encounter them on somewhat of a timely basis. It's very strange. It's like once you see one or have an encounter with one, or more than encounter, it's like once you see one or have an encounter with one, more encounters will follow suit, and I'm not sure why that is. I had an absolutely terrifying dinner over at my girlfriend's parents' house just a few years ago. My girlfriend's parents live out in the high desert, and near their house, there is a large canyon that feeds into a smaller river down at the bottom. Since it is high desert, there's lots of locust trees, mild brush, and it's fairly open with only minor tree coverage. I know sometimes they will get coyotes and possibly even mountain lions, but I don't really know what else. I mention these things to you because I'm not exactly sure what we encountered that night. Whatever it was spooked the hell out of my girlfriend and her parents and I. It hasn't happened since to my knowledge, but either way, it was quite the experience. So, we are over for dinner, having a great time socializing with her parents, and we had just finished having dessert. We're sitting around her living room talking when we begin to hear coyotes off in the distance. We all just sit there quietly, and I mentioned to her father that, wow, the coyotes are really acting up tonight, I see. And he just kind of chuckles and says, yeah, you'll hear them quite often, and they'll usually yip and yap from time to time. About 3 or so seconds later, we all heard the most powerful and horrific wolf howl we have ever heard. Or at least that's the closest animal we could attach it to. It sounded like a wolf howl, but on steroids. It was so loud. We all looked at each other confused when her father and I both, at the same time, said, "What the hell was that?" And we get up to try and look out the window, but nothing. It sounded so close by, but it's so dark outside, and her parents only have seldom lights around their property. I asked him if there's any wolves around here, and he said there hasn't been any for a long time. But he said that howl sounded like it came from something bigger than a wolf. This is where things get even creepier. We continue on with the night and conversation, and probably a good 15 or 20 minutes later, that pack of coyotes was much closer to the house. This time, they started to go off in a crying, crazy frenzy, whimpering in a giant chorus of coyotes. Her dad and I were bamboozled at what the hell we were hearing, and so both of us stepped outside to see if we can get any sort of clue or inkling to what was going on. But nothing. We could tell that these coyotes were often in the woodline, whooping and hollering, and making all sorts of racket. We figured that they had gotten a kill, which is why all the commotion was going on around the distant. But this sounded different than your typical coyote whooping and hollering. They were afraid and crying, yipping and yapping and whining. It was strange and very disturbing to say the least. Her father and I stood outside listening for some time, with my girlfriend begging us to come back in, and that she did not feel safe, while me and him tried to comfort her, telling her it was all right. It went quiet after a while, and we sat there, talking, trying to speculate what it was we were hearing exactly and what was going on. I found it fascinating, even though I was a little creeped out, I'm not gonna lie. That's when all the hairs on my head and arms started to stand up, like I felt like I was in danger. Once again, her father broke the silence and said, "Do you feel that?" And I said, "What?" He said, "We need to go inside now. We're being watched." Without hesitating, I took both steps inside the house and asked him, "By what?" And I'll never forget the way he looked me in the eyes with the most stern and serious expression, and just told me, "I don't know." The rest of the night, my girlfriend and I just sat down and watched some Netflix to try and forget about the whole thing. I'm not too sure what her father and mother did, but I'm assuming they kept busy inside, because neither of them went back out. I think things quieted down or so, I think. The next morning, her father woke me up in a daze and said, "You gotta come see this now." Still dazed and groggy from waking up on a funky REM cycle spot, my girlfriend and I stumbled up out of bed to see what her dad was talking about. All along the large pasture, just a little ways out from their house in perfect view, was a clear view of this coyote bloodbath. There were dead coyotes strung all throughout the field. We all said a few choice words that I'm not going to repeat, but you can guess them. We ran out to the field to properly assess the damage, and we noticed that these coyotes had literally been torn to pieces. I'm not talking about just one or two coyotes. I'm talking about at least a dozen or so, it looked like. There were more chunks of flesh and meat than there were whole coyotes. I don't have an explanation for what happened, but I know it really bothered my girlfriend's father, based on his reactions and him kind of shutting down for the rest of the day. I had to pitch in and give him a hand on cleaning up that mess, and what a shit show that was, but we got it done. I really don't have an explanation for what happened, and I kind of just like to play it off as an overly aggressive mountain lion that got too close to those coyotes over food or something, but I'll never really know. Plus, there's really no explanation for that loud howl that we heard. I'm just thankful that I don't have any of that where I live, and I don't have to deal with it. This was back in the early 2000s when I would go and visit my uncle and grandfather, and my uncle would take me on rides on his motorcycle out in the back country. They lived out in Minnesota and had miles upon miles of beautiful backcountry roads that were sparsely traveled. It made great for riding around on a motorcycle. I have so many fond memories with me and my uncle, going riding for 30 minutes to an hour in the evening, just enjoying the wind blowing against your face. There were several times that we had a few bull elks here and there. That was pretty cool to see. I saw more deer more times than I can count, but I kind of figured that's usual for being out and about in the countryside. However, that was all ruined for me one night when my uncle decided to take me on a night motorcycle ride. He had never taken me during the nighttime, so I was ecstatic for the adventure. Plus, he told me he was going to take me on a different route than he normally takes. This excited me even more so. Oh, I should probably mention that I was only about 9 years old at the time, so I was still very young and very impressionable. We get on his bike and we're going off. He starts to take us down some roads that I wasn't too familiar with, and they trailed off and forked off of our usual routes that we would sometimes take. I was having the time of my life, even though there were hardly if any streetlights around, because hey, we're on the backcountry, and it was darker than dark. But I felt safe with my uncle. It's hard to say how long we were riding for before it happened, but at some point down one of the roads, my uncle and I turned our attention to this loud crashing sound to the right of the road just as we were passing it. It sounded like one of those Tomcat construction workery machineries that people drive around. It was so loud, and I remember thinking, is construction going on right now, this late at night? Just as we were passing, and I promise you on this, and I don't want you to think I'm crazy, the trees open up, and this large demon thing bolts out on all fours, begins sprinting after us on our motorcycle. I am screaming bloody murder, and my uncle kicks it into high gear, and we go soaring down the road. Of course, I was behind him, so I really had no idea how fast we were going, but if I had to guess, maybe 80 or 90 miles an hour. Whatever was chasing us was keeping up with us and was slowly inching closer and closer. I don't know what the hell it was, but the closest comparison I can make is if you've ever seen the Van Helsing movie. I think it came out in 2003. At the very end, he fights off Dracula and turns into this massive, monstrous wolf-looking creature. What I saw looked very similar in size and stature. The face was very similar to a giant snout full of crocodilian-like teeth. It had a sort of dog glow in the eyes, kind of like a red-orange color. It looked to me like somebody crossed a crocodile and a wolf with a splash of human and demon. This thing was hulking in size and dwarfed not only me, but my uncle and the bike. If I had to guess, I would say it was around 7 feet tall on all fours, with the head as big as my uncle, or so it seemed. It chased us for a minute, and then got extremely close to the bike, like it was going to reach out and grab us, but then it just jumped right off into the woods and vanished, just like that. I was still screaming and hysterical until we got back to his house. What happened that night was one of the most traumatic things to have happened in my life. I had to undergo therapy for a while, and it really messed me up seeing something like that. I think my uncle even gave up on his motorcycle license for a while, but I didn't really talk to him about it or knew how he felt. After that, I didn't ride with him on his bike anymore, and I kind of shut down for a while. I stopped going over there, and a few years later, I would come to find out that my uncle had a massive heart attack. It's a shame because I was close with him at the time. I guess I should have found out how he's come to terms with everything, but I'll never know now. I just wish I knew what it was. I don't think it was any known animal that I've ever seen or heard of. And when I say hulking and demonic looking, I mean it. This thing came straight out of hell, and you could just feel the evil emanating off of it. I have never felt such fear in my life. I also think that part was due to the fact that I believe it was toying with us. This thing was so massive, it could have caught up to us and ripped us both off the bike and eaten us right there. As it kept up with us and acted like it wasn't even breaking a sweat or trying to keep close. It's almost as if it just wanted to let us know that it could get us anytime it wanted, and we were helpless. I can't shake those feelings. I don't know what you want to call it, whatever it is I encountered that night, but I will tell you it was evil, and I don't wish that for anybody, ever. So, I've been a big follower of your channel for some time now, and have never had any cryptid encounters myself, or anything strange. As you know, everything has been shut down with the quarantine lately. That is, until just a few days ago when they opened up hunting. Well, everything else is still pretty shut down, but that's my one solace, and just in time for turkey season. Where I live, there's actually a few groups of turkeys traversing around the area. In fact, this area is so popular for turkey hunting that it's not uncommon that every year I have people that pull up to my property asking me if they can hunt. With the season opening back up, I've been really wanting to get me a big tom for some time now, and was worried that the season would never open back up. The only issue that I have is that I haven't seen the groups of turkeys that I saw last year. What's even more disturbing is the other day when I was walking around, I found several dead turkeys that weren't whole, if you know what I mean. I'm talking turkeys being ripped into pieces. Not all of them, and surprisingly, some of the girls or female turkeys that I have found with their heads completely torn off. Yesterday, about half a mile away from my house, I found a big tom that would have been perfect, but his insides had been ripped out entirely, and his neck was broken in half. It was a mess, but there was no blood. That's the weird thing. And I noticed also very large canine tracks. I know for a fact we don't have wolves, only coyotes at most. Well, mountain lions, of course. The neighbors around here don't have any dogs that I'm aware of, and I've been here for years now, so I believed I would have seen them. Plus, I live on private property, and I've never seen a dog here before. I could take a picture of the tracks because they are rather large, and I'm not saying it's a dogman, but it's really similar how everything I hear from your channel matches up with everything that I'm experiencing and seeing in person. Mutilated cadavers and large canine prints. It's just a red flag for me. I have not heard a single gobble gobble, or any sort of sign that there are live turkeys around my area, which, again, deeply disturbs me. Every May is usually full of turkeys, and there are plenty to go around, but not this year. Something has been killing them off, and there are no natural predators that I know of that would just mutilate a turkey with good meat on it and leave it. Think about it. A mountain lion wouldn't just leave a cadaver like that. And a pack of coyotes, well, the cadaver would disappear. Even wolves. No predator that I know of is this messy and kills for the sake of killing. Again, I'm not saying this is definitively a dogman, but I just find it really creepy now that there's such a striking similarity between what I hear and what I'm actually seeing with my own eyes. I should reiterate that the canine tracks are enormous. I haven't measured exactly, but my whole hand can fit inside the print. There didn't look like there had been much of a struggle on the turkey's end, and like I said, no blood either, which is so strange. I have not heard anything at night or during the day that would lead me to believe that I have a dogman problem. I have not heard any silence in the woods, nor have I felt anything weird, nor have I seen any weird shadows darting around the woods. I'll just have to keep my eyes and ears open and attentive to my area and let you know. Maybe other people have caught on by this point of the year, and so I've already had at least 3 to 4 people pull up and ask me if it's okay. This year so far, I've had 0. The quarantine might have something to do with all this, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll just have to keep you updated. I know this last summer, I encountered something paranormal and out of this world, but I'm not exactly sure what it would be. My friend and his family are convinced it's a skinwalker, but I believe it was something else. I do know a little bit about skinwalkers and dogmen, and Bigfoot too, and I don't believe what I encountered was everything that matches up to what a skinwalker is. My friend's family thoroughly believes that this was the spirit or being that represents a skinwalker, and well, I believe it was a dogman, or potentially a dogman spirit. Last July, I went and visited a close friend of mine who is native and lives on the Navajo reservation. We've been friends for years and met during a work retreat long ago. I thought I would make a vacation out of it by going to visit him. I stayed with him at his trailer for about a week or so, and then I went with him to go visit his family. His family is very enriched in Navajo culture and lore, and his mother especially can be very superstitious at times, but as of this event, I don't blame her for anything she believes or doesn't believe, or so I thought. My Navajo friend never really talked about skinwalkers or cryptids or anything that goes bump in the night. I guess I can't blame them, since it is a part of their culture not to talk about those things in fear of drawing them to you. I truly don't know how my friend felt about all that stuff because, well, he never really talked about it. When I met his family, which this was the first time, and they were very nice and lovingly invited me into their home to stay. His mom pulled me aside and warned me of her brother that had turned to the darker side of things and would sometimes appear around here at night just to start trouble. I didn't really understand what she meant by that, and at the time I thought she was just referring to him being a lowlife and a drunk and wanting to cause drama, so I left it at that. It's not like I haven't encountered my fair share of bums before. I never really asked my friend about his family or anything like that, so to my knowledge, my friend's uncle was nil. We stayed there for a few nights, and everything was as normal as you can get. On one of the nights, all of us were outside having a bonfire, talking, laughing, and eating good food, just like we had the nights before, when after a short time, my friend and his family began to get really quiet, and the laughing, good times and all, turns into a serious, stoic expressions. It was in that moment that I remember I could feel a shift in the mood and tonality around us. I don't know how else to describe it to you, but that's the best way I can. My friend and his family spoke together in Navajo in hushed tones, and I didn't understand a drop of that language, so I left trying to interpret the tone and demeanor as to what was being spoken about. After everybody got quiet, my friend started talking to his family, and they're very concerned. It was almost as if they were trying to conceal their voices from maybe not only me, but something else. At the time, I thought they were just trying to conceal their voice from me, but who knows. My friend turns around and walks up to me and says we need to go back inside the trailer right now. Confused, I thought we were having a good time, but he just keeps walking to the trailer and quickly keeps motioning for me to follow him, so I kind of just shrugged my shoulders, going along with whatever was happening. His dad was trying to put the fire out quickly, and Mom was rushing both me and my friend into the house. We got to the house, and the mother kept looking out the window, waiting for the father to run back up into the house. The father goes in and grabs the gun, and all the doors and windows become locked thoroughly. Now I'm starting to freak out just a little bit, because I wanted to know what's going on. Normally, you wouldn't have fires out here at nighttime, for fear that it may draw in terrible, terrible spirits. But I guess in this case, looking back, they had their whole property and family and house blessed, so they had weekly bonfires. Well, more like nightly, since they didn't have to worry about those kinds of things. Or so I thought. My friend comes up to me and whispers in my ear that his uncle is outside, and it's going to cause problems. I looked at him strangely and asked if he was drunk, and that we needed to call the police. That's when I heard its super loud bang on the trailer. The mom and father both shrieked, and the dad put his back up against the front door with a gun ready in his hands. At this point, I'm starting to freak the hell out, because I don't know what the hell is going on, but whatever it is feels ominous as hell. You could start to hear these heavy footsteps walking around the trailer outside, and heavy breathing. It didn't sound human. It had a There was so much gruff to the voice. Whatever it was, whoever it was pacing the trailer slowly, as if looking for a weak spot to try and break in. That's what it felt like to me, and I was becoming scared, terrified more likely. My friend and his family kept motioning me to be quiet and to listen, and this went on for probably a good 45 minutes, if I had to guess, but it is hard to say, because time feels like it's an eternity when you're in the moment. After a while, things got quiet for another little bit of time. Dad looked at us all and said we needed to leave the house now to be safe. With gun in hand, he motions for all of us to run outside and jump in their old van and flee. Me, still not knowing exactly what is going on, I'm kind of left with no choice but to tag along and to go with the flow, so scaredy cat me runs out there with them and hops in the van. As his dad is basically throwing us in the back of the van, I heard the most horrifying screech or roar that I've ever heard from behind the trailer, just off a little ways in the darkness. It sounded like a mix of a bear, crossed with a wolf, crossed with a dying woman being murdered. It sounded like it came from the pits of hell. I think that was the point in the night where I really felt true fear go down my spine. I felt like I was in danger. My friend and his mother were pale, and the mother was starting to cry, praying in Navajo. His dad is swearing in Navajo, and he's trying to get the van to start. I think it was an old beater van that had problems with the ignition, and it had issues starting up sometimes, if I remember correctly. I think I do remember at one point, though, my friend mentioned that they needed to have the whole engine replaced, but didn't have the money. Anyway, he gets the van going, and we're flying out of there onto the main highway. Now at this point, remember, it's nighttime. There ain't no lights around, except the stars outside. He's doing probably close to 70, maybe 80 miles an hour, and he's flooring it, trying to get away from where we just were. And we're all quiet in the back. Nobody's saying a word. When my friend looks up and looks out the window of the back of the van, he starts screaming and pointing and shouting something in Navajo. I look, and catching up with the van is the largest wolf I've ever seen in my life. I guess I could call it that because it resembled a wolf, but it looked so much more evil. It's like a wolf that came from hell, and it had kind of a smoky vapor to it, if that makes any sense. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's almost like it had black smoke emanating from it, and it had glowing red eyes and large teeth, like some sort of saber-toothed wolf or something, and it was massive. It was running on all fours and getting closer and closer to the van. We're all watching in horror, and then this thing just darts off to the right of the van and increases its speed to not only keep up with the van, but keep up on the driver's side window. and at this point, it's right next to the dad, and he's keeping up at about 80 miles an hour. We're all screaming. His dad pulls off of a fork in the road that was conveniently, thank you Lord, just a little bit ways off of where we were in that moment. The road is a little bit more rough, but he decided to go down that way to try and ward off the thing or whatever was chasing us. While he starts going down this road, the next thing is that this thing just disappears. It's a more primitive road, but by primitive, I mean it still has concrete and stuff, just hasn't been taken care of, so there's potholes and parts of the road that are severely cracked and damaged. We go down this road for I don't even know how long, maybe an hour, but that might be a bit of a stretch. At one point, he just pulled over and parks the van in the middle of nowhere, in the pitch black of night. He sits there and just starts sobbing against the wheel. A grown native man sobbing. My friend and his mother didn't say a word, and I'm not even sure what was going on. I'm trying to process what just happened, and there was some freakish demon wolf thing chasing the van the size of a car. I kind of blacked out, to be honest. I felt like it was so traumatic, my brain just had to escape and register that I really wasn't in reality anymore. My memory is kind of fuzzy, but I can tell you that we did end up sleeping in that van. It wasn't comfortable, I can tell you that, but I think we were just all so exhausted from sheer fear. I have no idea why it stopped following us and why his dad just pulled over to the side of the road, leaving us all vulnerable, but whatever it was, we didn't see it after we pulled off. I remember opening my eyes and it being daylight, or at least just starting to see the sunlight come out, with his dad outside of the van looking around. My friend and his mom were still asleep, and the dad just hops back in the van, turns the van on, and begins to turn back around to where their home was. I was exhausted and still terrified, but I didn't have the energy to ask what had just happened. Somewhere along the way home, my friend and his mother had woken up from their slumber, and we all just kind of sat there in silence, in trauma from the night before. At one point or another, we pulled back into their house, and we're all getting out of their van when the dad and mom walk up to the house and start talking nervously again in Navajo and praying, dropping to their knees. There were deep scratches all over the house and door. It looked like several Kodiak bears tried to maul their trailer. It was bad. My friend is trying to calmly talk to his parents as best as he can, and they're both so worked up they can't even think straight. My friend comes to me and pulls me aside and tells me we should leave, that it's not safe to be here anymore. I wasn't going to argue or try to ask questions. I just went along with everything, and gladly so. In the last 12 hours, I felt my life had flipped upside down entirely. We left, and the rest of the visit wasn't the same at all. My friend had completely shut down and didn't really speak much. Fast forward a little bit, and I was able to finally talk to him and what had happened that night. This is where things get a little creepy, and I really started connecting the dots. Turns out my friend's uncle at a young age murdered his little brother, or in this case, my friend's mother's youngest brother, whom at the time was a small child. This in turn caused him to be banished, and he took and turned to dark magic, becoming a skinwalker. They had a name for it that they called it, but I can't remember it. Basically, a skinwalker. Her brother became animalistic in nature, living in the wild and turning to evil. He had tried to come back, time to time, to torment his sister and my friend's family, taking the shape of hideous beings and animals. This is why they believed him to truly be a skinwalker. However, it gets more terrifying than this. That night in July, when we experienced what we did, it was later found out that her brother, whom had turned to evil practices, committed suicide in a satanic ritual of sorts that same evening. This led to further speculation that this was the actual evil spirit whom dwelled in his mom's brother, had come to enact revenge on the family for banishing years before. That's what he and their family believes now. Why it stopped following us in the van after some time is also another interesting story. I guess it just so happens that not too much further down the road, where his dad had pulled off, lived a medicine man in the community whom had much of the area blessed and had warded off dark spirits before in the past. This friend of mine, whom I won't name for respect of him and his family, claimed dark spirits were afraid of him. all the pieces started to connect more and more as time went on. Myself, I'm not really sure what to think or believe. I know their entire culture is very enriched in that sort of thing, and warding off bad spirits, but this was on a whole other level. I didn't think spirits or demons, call them whatever you will, could take physical form like what I saw, and chase down a van at 80 miles an hour. I do watch creepypasta stuff, and things on Dogman, Bigfoot, etc., so to see this in real life was more than terrifying. It was as if I was in a horror movie. It sure as hell resembled a dogman of sorts from what I could see out of the back of the van, but by resembling, I mean it just looked huge, hulking, like a hulking satanic saber wolf thing. I don't have an answer for you, but it caused me to shut down for weeks until I could finally talk about it with my friend and get some closure on what exactly happened and why. Maybe it was the spirit that dwelled in his uncle that came and attacked us. I have no idea. My friend and his family had prayed heavily for me in Navajo since I was there with them, as this happened so as to not attract any more of these things. They firmly believe that once you have a sighting with one of these, you become marked for more encounters. His parents had had their house blessed multiple times before this happened, in fear that her brother would return and seek revenge on her, as he had tried before. My friend had told me that this was the reason why this spirit or being wasn't able to enter their house, because it had been blessed by that medicine man. I know that skinwalkers and dark spirits are very much a part of Navajo and are very real. I couldn't imagine what it would be like dealing with these things on a normal basis. This almost makes me question what the definitive line is that really separates cryptids from spiritual beings. Are dogmen spiritual beings at all? Or are they just demons masquerading in physical form? After sitting on all of this for quite some time now, I've come to the possible conclusion that maybe dogmen are just spirits taking physical form and going after people, which is kind of what they do anyway. I could keep going on, but I'll end this and say that no, I don't believe this was a skinwalker. I believe it was a dogman in some way, shape, or form, regardless if it was a spiritual or flesh and blood being. I think there is more to generality in cryptids being spiritual beings more than we would like to think of, with all the ties to opening up portals to other dimensions and seeming to always not be around when we're looking for them. If you want to count the lack of blood trails from when they are shot, well, that's a whole other ballpark to get into. Besides, whatever chases a van down for as long as it did possessed supernatural power in its own right, and I know that no flesh and blood being alone, or at least just an animal, could have done that.